Now, talks over ending Russia's war on Ukraine face a major hurdle, and that is the Crimean Peninsula. US President Donald Trump says he would recognise the Russian-occupied province as part of Russia in order to get a peace deal. Now, that angers Ukrainians who see it as an inseparable part of their country. Here's a look at why the Black Sea Peninsula is so important to both sides.
Is Zelensky ready to give up Crimea, do you think, Mr. President?
Oh, I think so, yeah. Look, Crimea was 12 years ago.
Our position is unchanging. Only the Ukrainian people have the right to decide which territories are Ukrainian.
Two very different views on one peninsula. For US President Donald Trump, Crimea is a bargaining chip. But international law and the Ukrainian constitution state that Crimea is part of the country's territorial integrity. And it's also critical to Russia, which sees it as part of its territory. Crimea's strategic importance for Russia is the port of Sevastopol on the Black Sea. That allows Russia's navy to dominate the region and gives Russia access to the Mediterranean Sea as well. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred control from Russia to Ukraine, when both were states in the Soviet Union. After the USSR broke up in 1991, Crimea became an autonomous territory within Ukraine, but Russia held a lease on the Sevastopol naval base. All that changed in 2014. So-called Little Green Men, soldiers in unmarked uniforms, took control of Crimea with few shots being fired. Russia denied responsibility. A referendum that was widely condemned as rigged on joining Russia followed, and Russia annexed the peninsula. A major shock to Ukraine. Russia further asserted its control when it opened the Kerch Strait Bridge in 2018, a 20-kilometer span connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. That helped it build up a massive military presence in Crimea, which it used as one of its staging areas to attack Ukraine when Russia invaded in 2022. Troops based in Crimea were part of the forces that attacked Kherson and across southern Ukraine. Since the war started, Ukraine's paid special attention to Crimea, striking the Kerch Bridge in 2022 and 2023, a symbolic blow to Russian prestige and a way to cut off Russia's ability to resupply its troops in Crimea. And it's hit Russian military assets on land and in Sevastopol, allegedly using US-supplied ATACMS longer-range missiles, trying to make Crimea too painful for Russia to hold on to. But Russia has shown no sign of pulling up stakes, and even if Zelensky wanted to concede Crimea, as Trump has suggested, Ukraine's constitution forbids it, and the constitution can't be changed under martial law. Trump may be giving Russia just what it wants, international recognition of its conquest. Legal experts warn that recognizing Russia's annexation would set a precedent, encouraging other countries to grab land and change borders by force.
Professor Mark Kramer is Director of Cold War Studies at Harvard University in the US. I asked him earlier why Russian-held Crimea is so important to Ukrainians and to efforts at reaching an end to the war.
So Crimea, over 60 years, was seen as, and by the whole international community, as an integral part of Ukraine. And that's why Ukrainians nowadays, in looking at what happened in 2013, and especially early 2014, when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea, see it as symbolic of a larger Russian determination to dominate Ukraine and to basically have Ukraine as a subordinate element vis-a-vis Russia, rather than as a truly independent country.
Professor Kramer, stay with me if you would. We're going to hear from some Ukrainian residents, their thoughts about President Trump's willingness to see Ukraine relinquish Crimea to Russia. We're going to have a listen. I'll come right back to you.
I have a lot of friends who want to return home to Ukrainian Crimea, not Russian Crimea.
By recognizing Crimea as Russian and the rest of the territories under de facto Russian control, it will lead to Putin wanting Riga, Latvia in 3 days, which will be much easier than Kiev in 30 years, and so on and so forth. China will want Taiwan.
What politicians want is one thing, but the soldiers won't allow it. We have already sacrificed too many of our very best people. I think it would show weakness in the extreme.
I have no clear opinion, because we're already used to the occupation of Crimea. I just want to stop these killings from the war, the explosions, the crying.
Professor, the last voice we heard there, she was saying she's now used to the Russian occupation of Crimea. Do you think that's what Donald Trump is banking on, as well as Vladimir Putin?
De facto, Crimea has been part of the Russian Federation for 11 years. The Trump administration, President Trump himself, has proposed now to recognize it as de jure part that is, is a legally established and recognized part of the Russian Federation, which would be a big leap. It would be changing it from recognizing it as de facto Russian territory, which it is. It's occupied by Russia and has been for 11 years. But establishing it as a de jure part of the Russian Federation would be very different from, say, what the United States and other Western countries did during the Cold War when they refused to recognize the Baltic states as a de jure part of the Soviet Union. They certainly recognized that those republics were operating within the Soviet Union and that the Soviet government claimed them, but they never accepted that they were legally part of the Soviet Union. So this would be very different. This would essentially be acknowledging the right of Russia to conquer parts of a foreign country, and that would be a dangerous precedent in my view, as well as the view of many Ukrainians.
We just heard in that report, even if President Zelensky agreed to cede Crimea, he couldn't because it would require a change to the Ukrainian constitution, and that can't happen because it can't be changed under martial law. So, as you're saying, I mean, not only would it be a huge move, it's also, I mean, legally not possible. Do you think, though, that Ukraine may ultimately have to let Crimea go, as the Trump administration seems to believe?
Yes, absolutely. No, you make a very good point here. Is Ukraine is not a dictatorship. Apparently, Trump himself thinks it operates the same way Russia does, where what happens in Russia is determined by Putin and Putin alone. Zelensky doesn't have that kind of authority in Ukraine because there is a Ukrainian parliament that has a big say in any treaty or agreement that would be signed, and they will never accept a deal that gives de jure control of Crimea to Russia. So there is inherently an obstacle that Zelensky would face, even if he wanted to yield Crimea. It wouldn't, in the Ukrainian political system, it wouldn't work. But beyond that, there are some major problems, and these were highlighted in the documentary. Crimea under Russian occupation has been highly militarized, and so it means that if this region were left under Russian control and recognized as part of the Russian Federation, that Russia would have a large military contingent ready to move into Ukraine at short notice. And that would be, again, a very dangerous precedent to set, that any settlement that emerges has to guarantee that Ukraine will not undergo a future invasion from Russia. That is solid security guarantees. And with Crimea under Russian, if Crimea were recognized as part of the Russian Federation, that wouldn't be possible. Short of, and here I will come to the point you raised as well, is there are potential circumstances in which I could envisage that the Ukrainian government might be willing to yield Crimea, but there are circumstances the Russian government would never accept. For example, if Russia were formally to acknowledge that it illegally occupied and annexed Crimea, if it were to offer reparations of, say, 50 billion euros, if it were to agree to demilitarize the whole peninsula, and if it were to agree to have a international military presence, peacekeeping presence in Crimea. I could see that perhaps under those circumstances, Ukrainian leaders would be willing to accept the transfer of Crimea, but those conditions will never be acceptable to the Russian government.
Harvard Professor of Cold War Studies, Mark Kramer. Professor Kramer, thank you so much for your insights. We do appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to speak with you.
Let's take a closer look at Crimea's importance with Paul Good, who's a chair of Russian Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Welcome to DW. So is Crimea getting in the way of reaching an end to this war?
Well, Crimea is an important part of Ukraine, and it's important to remember that for most Ukrainians, Russia's war on Ukraine began with the occupation of Crimea in 2014, which was then followed by the insurgencies that Russia sponsored in eastern Ukraine and have continued up to this point. So in that sense, Crimea has always been a pivotal part of resolving this war between Russia and Ukraine.
OK. Stay with us. We're going to hear from some Ukrainians. We'll get their thoughts about President Trump's willingness to see their country relinquish Crimea to Russia. Then we'll come back to you.
I have a lot of friends who want to return home to Ukrainian Crimea, not Russian Crimea.
By recognizing Crimea as Russian and the rest of the territories under de facto Russian control, it will lead to Putin wanting Riga, Latvia in 3 days, which will be much easier than Kiev in 30 years, and so on and so forth. China will want Taiwan.
What politicians want is one thing, but the soldiers won't allow it. We have already sacrificed too many of our very best people. I think it would show weakness in the extreme.
I have no clear opinion because we're already used to the occupation of Crimea. I just want to stop these killings from the war, the explosions, the crying.
Paul Good, can we pick up on that last point that lady made, saying that she's now used to Russia's occupation of Crimea? Is that de facto ownership over 11 years what Vladimir Putin and indeed Donald Trump are now banking on?
It is, and this was something that was already starting to manifest, I think, in Ukrainian public opinion prior to the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. At that point, Ukrainians still were firmly in support of returning Crimea to Ukraine. But the primary obstacles that were viewed to that return were seen primarily as Russia's forces first located within Crimea, and then also the duration of occupation. And over time, from Russia's perspective as well, Crimea has been effectively naturalized in domestic politics and society as part of Russia. The occupation and annexation of Crimea by Russia was arguably the high point for Putin's rule in the 2010s, and has remained sort of a linchpin of the regime's patriotic claims to legitimacy to this day. So for both sides, really, Russia's occupation of Crimea has become very firmly entrenched.
Right. And do you think, though, looking forward, do you think Ukraine will ultimately end up having to cede Crimea to Russia?
I think it would be extremely difficult for anybody in Ukrainian politics to sell the idea to the Ukrainian population of ceding Crimea at this point. And so possibly in the form of a temporary measure to achieve a ceasefire. That is one possibility that could be floated. There is a difference in Ukrainian public opinion in terms of the desirability of returning Crimea as opposed to returning the territories that have been occupied since 2022. And those latter territories are seen very much as a non-starter, as in ceding that territory is not an option. Whereas some form of agreeing to a temporary occupation of Crimea, which would in effect be the ongoing occupation of Crimea, is something that could potentially be linked to security guarantees that might lead to a durable peace. However, those guarantees would have to be coming from the West. No security guarantee from Russia
would be viewed as credible, and especially certainly not any that would involve any sort of territorial gain. As you saw in the interviews, public opinion in Ukraine is also very firmly in the sense that any territorial concession will only embolden Russia further. And if it's not in the short term, it will certainly be in the long term, now that Russia's moved into very much sort of a neo-imperial mode of territorial acquisition.
OK, so in that speculative future, if Ukraine were somehow able to take or indeed negotiate Crimea back into Ukrainian hands, what would security guarantees you've mentioned, but just life and commerce, what would that look in the region? What would that look like?
Well, it would definitely be difficult adjustment in the short term, given that Crimea has been deeply connected with Russia's own infrastructure. And so if it were to be returned to Ukraine, then that would require a complete reorientation of everything from water to electricity, as well as transportation, to bring Crimea back into the Ukrainian state. And so certainly there would need to be a transitional period of some sort. There's also sort of the outstanding question, of course, what happens to Russia's base in Sevastopol, which remains an open question and one which is not going to be easily resolved.
Thanks for talking us through that so clearly. Paul Good from Carleton University in Ottawa. Thanks so much.
Thank you.